I'm Bob at ILikeToMakeStuff. Today I'm gonna make a yo-yo. Not too long ago, I was at a really cool event and I got to take a 30-minute class on the yo-yo. I'd actually never spent 30 minutes with a yo-yo before, so I immediately started thinking about how to make one. This is the one I got in that class, and it actually has a bearing on the inside, which is something new to me as well. So I decided to give it a shot and make my own. Let me show you how it went. I started by tracing the outline of my reference yo-yo on a thick piece of maple and then measured that circle. Once I knew that size, I cut it down to a rough square. It was pretty close. I used a couple of extra pieces of basswood, which were scraps left over from another project, and cut them down to roughly the same size as well. Then on the table saw, I squared these all up. There was one main piece of maple and 2 pieces of basswood, which are going to be sacrificial for the lathe. I added some glue and stacked all these up, put them in the clamps to dry. After this dried, I drew a line from corner to corner. Where they meet is the center point. So I used that point and the lines to put on the faceplate and make sure that it was centered within the block of wood. I put in 4 screws and then slid it onto the lathe. I lined up the other center point with the tailstock and then started turning. The first objective here was just to get it down to the right size cylinder. So I used some calipers to measure my reference yo-yo and then just turned down the main cylinder until they were roughly the same size. Then I found the center point of my piece of maple and held a pencil in place while turning it. This gives me a center line all the way around it that I can use for reference. Then I just experimented with shaping until I got it looking like I wanted to. I cut in the butterfly shape in the center and then started to round over the outside edges of the piece of maple before turning down the speed and doing a little bit of sanding. I realized that my parting tool was not sharp, so I used a handsaw just to split these pieces right down the middle. I took off one end, and then while the other end was still on the faceplate, I flattened it out with one of my tools. Then I took it off, unscrewed the faceplate, lined it up with the other X on the other piece, put it back on, and flattened out that face as well. I held the pieces up next to each other several times to make sure that they were the same shape and the same thickness before finally parting them off their basswood stands. Let me point something out really quickly that I cannot do just because I don't have the right tools. I need to drill a really precise hole at the very center of both of these pieces, and the best way to do that is to take a drill chuck, put it in the tailstock, and actually drill into the very center of this piece while it's still on the lathe. Unfortunately, I don't have that drill chuck here to use. I'm just letting you know that if you have that, that's the best way to drill a center hole in something that's on the lathe. And since I don't have it, I'm gonna come up with another way to do it. Before moving on to drilling, I had to make sure that the outside faces were perfectly flat, and I did that with a belt sander. I left a little bit of a nub right in the center of the inside of each piece, and I ran over it with a pencil so that I could see it, and then used a center punch to mark it. I found the drill bit that I had that was closest to the size of the bearing and then set the depth stop on my drill press. This makes sure that the bit doesn't drill too deep, a little bit less than half the thickness of the bearing. I drilled the same hole in both sides and then used a smaller bit that was the same size as the inside of the bearing to drill a center hole a little bit deeper on both of these pieces. This is going to hold the axle that goes through the bearing and holds the 2 outside pieces together. And for that axle, I'm using the bearing removal tool that actually came in the package. I just used a hacksaw to cut it off to length. I used some rough sandpaper to go over this cut edge just to smooth out the burrs. I also weighed both sides to make sure that they were the same weight because that's very important. I did a test fit before gluing anything up to make sure that the rod was the right length and everything spun freely. Then I used some 5-minute epoxy and mixed it up with a very, very tiny paintbrush. I put this all the way down on the bottom of the holes on both pieces and pushed in the rod. I wanted to make sure that this epoxy did not touch where the bearing was going to be because I didn't want it to be glued in place. That would defeat the purpose. After this dried, I held the inside bearing with some wire cutters and then spun it around to make sure that the bearing was free before putting on a string and testing it out. Of course, I just had to add a little bit of flair with my laser before adding a couple of coats of spray lacquer just to finish it off. It took a little bit of practice to get the feel of this one, and I tried it with a couple of different length strings, and it actually worked after a little while. As a first go, I actually think it turned out pretty good. It's not perfect, and it doesn't work every single time, but I think the bearing runs smoothly. The big issue seems to be the shape. When I look at the butterfly that I got originally, the ridges on the inside of this, where the string meets the outside plastic, is a lot more rounded than what I ended up with here. So I think what's happening on mine is the string is actually hitting on this little ridge right here and slowing it down. That could easily be fixed just by modifying the shape the next time I do one. You saw me weigh the two sides, so they are balanced as far as weight, but it's possible that there's some small shape differences, and maybe that has something to do with creating wobble. I really don't know that much about yo-yos and how they're made and why they work and why they don't, so if you have any information as to why this one doesn't work as well as this one, other than the fact that I made it, let me know some things that I can change in version 2 to make it work even better. I hope you liked this one, and if you did, give me a thumbs up and maybe a comment. If you're not interested in yo-yos, I have a lot of other types of projects that you might dig, so be sure to check those out, and don't forget to subscribe. I've also got a second channel here with some non-project stuff that you might be interested in as well. That's it for this one, guys. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.